You are at the intersection of wealth, health, and happiness. Welcome to the Wealthy Wellthy Life. Hi, I'm Krisstina Wise, and welcome to this edition of Wealthy Wellthy Life, where I interview thought leaders who teach a countercultural approach to money, health, and happiness, because a good life is a wealthy, wealthy life. Today, I talk to Mark Goulston, Dr. Mark Goulston, and we really tap into the happiness equation of money, health, and happiness. Mark is a former FBI and hostage negotiator. He's the author of the book Just Listen, which was ranked #1 in 6 Amazon and Kindle categories. His column, Solve Anything with Dr. Mark, is nationally syndicated by Tribune Media Services. He's been a professor of medicine at UCLA for over 20 years. He's been featured on several media outlets like Oprah, The Today Show, CNN, and more. And he writes for blogs like Huffington Post, Business Insider, and Psychology Today. Pretty impressive man and background. Great conversation. Oh my goodness, I could have stayed on the phone with him forever. I really enjoyed meeting him and getting to know him. Quite a privilege. We talk about in this episode high achiever personality and the pursuit of success through buying happiness. We talk about PTSD and trauma, how it can affect performance and how we can overcome it, and really how to treat trauma and treat some of these issues psychologically that sometimes hold us back. So really informative interview. Plus, he has a great personality, so I know you'll love it. Dr. Mark, it is so good to meet you, and thank you for your time today.
Well, I was looking forward to this, and I can't wait to get started. I can hardly wait to find out what we say.
Well, me too. Let's see what happens. You are so interesting. My goodness, such a broad array of experience and expertise and types of help you've offered. But I have to say, what really intrigued me right off the bat, you're an MD in the sense of psychiatry. So you're a psychiatrist, obviously in the psychology profession, but you did a lot of work with hostage negotiation, FBI and police hostage negotiation. Tell me, talk to us about that. How did you find yourself as a psychologist, psychiatrist, this field, make way over to hostage negotiation, and what does one have to do with the other?
Well, for many years, I was a suicide specialist, and for many years, I was a guest lecturer in a course at UCLA. And I would do this role play. There's actually a video clip up at UCLA, up at YouTube called I'm Going to Kill Myself. And Mark Goulston, you'll see me in the 90s. And what would happen is I would transform myself into the devil's advocate and take on the audience. So for the suicide class, I'd become a suicidal person, and they'd have to talk me out of it. And then I was speaking to parents groups of middle schools and high schools. And there was one meeting we had, which was how to keep your child safe. And there was an FBI agent there. And he was talking about, the things you should look out for. And this was a private school. So you can imagine, kind of the parents can be a tad uptight. And so so I did a role play there with the parents, and it was called It's My Party and I'll Die If I Want to. And so what I did is I became this hostile teenager, and I challenged the audience. And I got in all my role plays, I get people very agitated. And when they're agitated, I then tell them this is what you could have said or should have asked, but didn't. I did this with Goldman Sachs on Wall Street to the top directors of private wealth, and I played someone who was once worth $250 million, and now I took a hit and I was 150, and they had to talk me from going from JP Morgan over to them. And what happens is when I bait the audience, they always take the bait. So this FBI agent said, maybe you could do this with some of our agents and some police. So what I started doing was a series of these role plays where I would take off my suit jacket, and underneath I had a police uniform. There's even a video of this on YouTube. And I had a police uniform on. I hadn't shaved for a couple of weeks. I had a pair of glasses that I think were broken. And I said, I'm the officer in your department, and I'm the one who shot the kid with the plastic gun last year. I've been on medical leave for a year, and then I pull a gun out, hold it to my neck, and say, and unless you talk me out of it, I'm going on permanent leave, and then you live with the ghost of someone that you should have been able to save, and this time it's one of your own. And then what would happen is, no matter what they did or said, I got them more agitated, and I always pull the trigger. And then from that, I was able to get into the role of that person and say, this is what you should have told me or asked me. And this, it actually went on beyond FBI hostage negotiation. So that was the kind of training. And then I do some ride-alongs. But I also worked in the O.J. Simpson trial with the prosecution. And what I would do when I sat in court is I could close my eyes for 10 seconds, open them, and I could look at the courtroom from any position in the courtroom, the jury, the witnesses, Judge Ito, anyone. And from that point of view, I could come up with what I needed to hear or see that would cause me to agree with it. So one thing that they didn't use of mine is when they were showing up DNA evidence, which was very new then. I said, this jury is not the most educated, and what you need to do is hold up a Coca-Cola can and show the barcode, because people will trust the barcode at a supermarket more than the cashier, and the barcode looks like DNA. They didn't use that. One thing they did use at the end of it, when they were going into deliberation, I was thinking to myself, okay, how do you control a jury when it goes into deliberation? And I thought, well, and this is how my thinking goes. I said, well, you want to haunt them. So what would haunt them? And I told Marsha Clark, I said, somewhere in your closing argument, play the tape of Nicole Brown Simpson identifying O.J. Simpson, banging on her back door, trying to break in. I said, because at the end of the trial, people often forget a lot of the stuff in between, but the voice of a murder victim mentioning the person that killed her, could grab their attention, and that could leave a lasting impression. So all through my career, in my books, it's been how do you listen to people from their inside out? And what happens is when you get that correctly, they lean in. So for instance, I'm going to give you an example of listening to you from your inside out, and you haven't said a word. So as I'm looking at your lovely face, and you haven't kicked me to the curb yet, so I'm still staying interesting and hopefully relevant. What I'm not hearing, but I'm guessing, is that it's really important for you to bring value to your listeners. And this is close to a calling. It's not just, you like doing it, but it's a calling. And you're probably listening for who's going to give value to my listeners. And I hope I don't get someone on that is a waste of their time and my time. And then I have to come up with an excuse of how I couldn't broadcast it because it was unlistenable. And so is any of that accurate?
You are 100% bullseye target.
And so what I try to do when I'm coaching people, whether it's their families, whether it's a business, is it's what people want you to hear. They're broadcasting loud and clear with their words, between the words. And if you can just be what my late mentor, a big leadership guy, Warren Bennis, said. He said, be a first-class noticer. Because when you notice, it's different than looking, watching, and seeing. So looking, watching, and seeing, you're an observer. You're passive. But when you notice, you're connected to whoever you're noticing. And here's one of the great ironies, because I coach a lot of people, especially women, on how to be present. And here's a great irony. You are most present when you are completely focused on the other person. And as soon as you are focused on yourself, you are absent. Mm. And if you can do that, people are so hungry for people to be present with them. People will just magnetically be drawn to you.
So what I hear you saying, I think, is that so much of these, for example, hostage negotiations, you're just listening for what they're trying to say, what they need to be heard. And there's something in there that you're trying to, versus being reactive, which tends to be such the nature and responding from our own feelings and observations. It's what's going on with that other person? What do they need to say that's gotten them to this place? What are they broadcasting? What can I listen to from the inside out? Because there's something underneath. If I can get to the bottom of that, maybe I can save them. Is it something like that?
You listen very well. I'll give you an example from Just Listen. It's in the first chapter, so there's an anecdote in there. And it uses something that I call the magical paradox. And the magical paradox is when you can put into words what the other person is not saying that might be negative, they are drawn to what you say. So in that anecdote, there was a perpetrator, imagine, in a big parking lot. In this case, he didn't have a hostage, but he had a shotgun, and he was threatening to shoot himself or shoot someone else. So the SWAT team is brought in, and of course they're hiding because you don't want to agitate them. And then there's a lead negotiator who is doing the speaking, and then there's backup negotiator who's getting data on this person. And the backup negotiator had taken one of my training classes. So imagine this. What the backup negotiator is discovering is that this was not really a bad person. What had happened is he had lost his job. He was divorced. He was kicked out of his home. And what had happened is that there was a restraining order put on him, and he just was at his wit's end. So imagine that that's the data that's coming in. And so what the backup negotiator says to the lead negotiator, let's say this to him. And here's the magic paradox. Say to this person, I'll bet you feel right now that nobody understands what it's like to have everything in your life backfire and be left with this as your only option. Isn't that true? And so what that person then says is, yeah, you're right. Nobody understands and nobody gives a flying such and such. But you can see that as he's saying that, he's leaning into feeling understood. And he's leaning away from his agitation. And then I think the second thing they said is, I'll bet you feel that nobody understands what it's like to start every day and think it's only going to get worse as opposed to better. Isn't that true? And so can you see in your mind's eye that you're giving him words for what he's feeling but not expressing? And there's a fellow named Matthew Lieberman. He's a researcher at UCLA. And what he has said is that when people accurately express their feelings with their words, amygdala activation goes down a third. And the amygdala is in our brain. It's in our emotional brain. And when we get overly stressed, the amygdala hijacks us away from being able to think and throws us into fight or flight. So I make a distinction between stress and distress. So when you're under stress, you can still stay focused on your goals with difficulty. And actually, stress helps you get stronger and more resilient. But when it gets too much, the stress crosses over into distress. And then the goal is get out of the distress any way you can. And that's when your amygdala has taken you away. And so when someone accurately expresses their feelings to another person, or what I have just demonstrated with the magical paradox is something called mediated catharsis. And what that means is you help them have a catharsis and you mediate it with what you're saying. So here's a tip for your audience too, because I recently did a podcast, and one of the segments was how to get your teenager to do their homework without a fight. Not an unusual situation. And this particular host, a lot of their audience was women. And so I said, this is what I want you to imagine. It may not work with all of them, but imagine that you have a teenager and you're getting on their back about their homework and they get agitated. And so go into their room and you have to have a tone. You have to have a calm tone. You can't have a B word tone. And you can't be whining because that will just trigger them. And you go in there and you have a method to your madness, which I'm going to give you. And you walk in there and you look your teenager in his or her eye and say, hey, I want to try something with you. But you say it in a tone in which they might say, what? You could say, no, hey, go along with me. I think this could work. And they say, what? And you look them straight in the eye, like I'm looking into your eyes. And you say to your teenager, I want you to repeat this and see if you can say it with feeling. What do you mean? Just listen to me. And then you say to your teenager, say to me, Mom, would you get off my effing back already? You're getting me more and more angry and it's making it worse. And then what's going to happen? Your kid's going to say, what? And you say that with some feeling. And then they'll say it a little bit. And then you can say, no, lean into it. And then they'll start to giggle. And the reason they'll giggle is you're giving them relief from resenting you. There is a resentment that teenagers have towards their parents that's chilling. They don't know where it comes from, and they hate hating their parents. And so when you're giving them the ability to express it fully, and you keep pulling it off them until they're really into it, and then and what you'll feel is there'll just be this relief. And see, you don't get defensive because you're inviting them to hit you with their best shot. And then when they get it, you look at them and you could say, I think you nailed it, dinner in an hour, and you leave. Now, it won't always work, but what you've done is they're going to be grateful to you for helping relieve their anger and resentment. And out of that gratitude, there's a greater chance that they won't fight because, they'll be grateful to you. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense, kind of?
It makes total sense. And you've touched on a few things that are really big here is, I think in my listening, even talking about back to the Hostage Association, is that it's reaching this point of desperation. Like, I think most of the times it's pretty hard to go through life and not at least hitting some time in your life where you feel completely desperate, like there's no way out or something. And it's a terrible place to be. I've been there myself when I was really sick and I had my own breakdown, psychic break as well as physical break. And there's that feeling of just being so desperate that nobody understands. And I think that's the most horrific place in the world to be, is to reach this place in life where nobody gets it. Nobody could understand my level of suffering. And that would turn into more suffering. So, and underneath that, it's like exactly what you said is that, but nobody really tries to understand either. They give you advice or pick up yourself by your bootstraps, or you should be this way or that way, or do this or that. And at the end of the day, I think what I'm listening to you saying is that we all just want to be heard. And sometimes we don't even have the right words to express our own emotions. You're right. If somebody can kind of give us the words for us, it's like, yes, that's exactly what I feel. You understand. You've been there. You can relate. And it's this connection of human to human, like somebody else does get me. Somebody else has been there. And it can give someone hope because it's realizing that somebody gets it and there's another example on the other side. But what that requires, I think what you're saying is we have to be able to be present. We have to be able to focus on this other human being and just listen and just be there with them. And that's what we don't take time for anymore. I mean, it's so missing. And does it stand to reason, or is there any wonder why there is so much suffering and disconnection? Because we're too busy to sit here, you and I, just listening to each other and getting to know one another, trying to really empathize.
You're right. I wrote a blog, I think about a year ago, about Robin Williams. And I said, Robin Williams did not die from depression. He died from despair. And when I give talks to universities on suicidal thinking, I talk about despair as a word that if you break it into DES and PAIR, it means feeling unpaired. and you feel unpaired with hope, that's hopeless. Unpaired with help, helpless, worthless, meaningless, pointless, useless. And when you feel unpaired with all of those things and they all line up, you pair with death as a way out. And so when I would occasionally be a visiting teacher to the inpatient wards, I'd say you need to pair with them in their pain. And there's a saying that I have: pain is pain, suffering is feeling totally alone in pain. And if you can connect with people in their suffering they can't live with becomes pain that they can. Can I share an anecdote that I think will give you kind of the eewee-jeewees?
Oh, please.
So I used to be this heavyweight suicide interventionist. And my first mentor actually he was a pioneer, and he started the suicide prevention centers in Washington and Los Angeles. And what would happen is he would consult to the inpatient wards, and because there would be individuals who needed to be discharged, but they were still suicidal, but they weren't acutely suicidal, and you can't keep them there forever. And in order to be discharged, you needed a doctor outside in the community who'd be willing to see them, and the residents didn't want to see them because the residents were less trained and they were nervous. And so Dr. Ed Schneidman would go up, he would speak to them, and he would always call me the same way. I get a call on my phone, and he'd say, "Mark, this is Ed. I'm with this lovely young woman. She's in a lot of pain, Mark. You could help her, Mark. See her." And then it would be referred to me. And there was one woman in particular, and I will call her Nancy, and I talk about this in my book, Just Listen. And I didn't think I was helping her. She was coming in 2 or 3 times a week. She had made 4 attempts in the previous 3 or 4 years. And the most recent one is, I think she had jumped off a balcony, and her whole back had been sort of crushed, and she was in all these different surgeries. And she would come in, and she would look 30 degrees to the left or right of me, and I thought I was doing nothing except, she kept coming in regularly. And I was seeing her for about 6 months, and I used to moonlight once a month, which would mean I would work at a state psychiatric hospital to pick up extra money. And so sometimes when you moonlight, you're up 36 hours sometimes, and you're covering for the whole hospital. And so there was a Monday that I came back, and if you've ever pulled an all-nighter, it does interesting things to your body. Your teeth are kind of loose. Your sphincters have a mind of their own. Your skin feels kind of, you don't know whether to sweat or you get chills. And it does things to your mind. So I'm there seated with Nancy. And she's just sort of, looking. And she kind of looks like this. The listeners can't see it, but you can see it. But she'd have this look like this. Now, she wasn't catatonic. And again, I didn't think I was helping her. And so I'm seated with her. And suddenly all the color in the room turns to black and white. And I thought, wow, this is weird. But, I'm kind of young, adventurous. I said, well, this is kind of interesting. And then the black and white turned to this chilling gray. It just started getting mushy. And I thought, I'm having a stroke or a seizure. Now, I'm a medical doctor. I'm a psychiatrist. So I do a neurologic exam on myself. And she's not looking at me, so it's not rude. So I'm going like this, and I'm going like this. I'm putting my finger up. I'm touching my nose. I'm tapping my knees. And I thought, well, I'm not having a stroke or a seizure. And then I thought, again, I'm overtired. I think I am seeing the world through her eyes and feeling it. So I leaned into it, and it got worse and worse and worse. And years later, I was telling a friend of mine, Reverend Jim Kowalski, he's the main reverend at St. John the Divine Cathedral, the Gothic Cathedral in Manhattan. And he just said, you went into the dark night of the soul. And I didn't know that's what I had done, but because I was sleep deprived, this is what I said to her. So imagine this. I said, Nancy, I didn't know it was so bad, and I can't help you kill yourself. But if you do, I will still think well of you. I will miss you. And maybe I'll understand why you had to get out of the pain. And then I said to myself, did I think that or did I say that? And I went, uh-oh, I think I just gave her permission. And that was the first time she looked at me. And when she looked at me and our eyes met, I realized I had it right, what I was seeing. And I thought she was going to say, thank you for understanding me. I'm overdue for my next attempt. And I said, what are you thinking? And she looked at me and she said, if you can really understand why I might have to kill myself to get out of this pain, maybe I won't need to. And then she smiled and she gave up her suicidality. And what I try to get out into the world is it's there waiting for you in your relationships. All you have to do is be intent on alleviating pain, fear, and anger in basically good people. And all you have to do is keep saying what's really going on. I was part of a transition program for returning Marines, and a good friend of mine, General Marty Steele, he ran the Marines in the 90s, and he was the first CEO of the U.S. Intrepid, the aircraft carrier on the Hudson. And I worked with him on a transition program for Marines from 2006 to 2008. And then the market hit and it was privately funded. And so that was about a week-long deep immersion program for Marines before they were released. And they did a Myers-Briggs because General Steele liked that. He thought you should be introspective. They'd help you kind of in terms of resume and how you interviewed. But what every Marine said was the best part of the week was they each got an hour and a half one-on-one time with General Steele. And General Steele has, I forget his Myers-Briggs profile, but he says it's the most unusual profile in the Marines because he was an intuitive, he was empathic, but he could also be a commander. And I said, what did you talk to these Marines about? And he said, I meet with them. I looked them in the eye. And, when you're a Marine all your life. And I'd say, Marine, what's going on? And I'd look them right in the eye, strong, protective, but firm. And they'd say, well, sir, it's kind of a tough transition. And I'm trying to do this. And they'd finish. He'd say, what's really going on, Marine? And they'd say, well, my spouse and I, or my wife and I were arguing. And, it's kind of very frustrating. And he would keep saying that until they got to a point, and then he shared this with me, that they get to a point where they would just stare him right in the eye and they'd say, sir, I saw and did awful things. And when I close my eyes, I see them more clearly, so I don't close my eyes much, sir. And then what he did, imagine this, and he's connecting, like you and I are looking into each other's eyes. He said, Marine, if you were a Marine in active duty, we all saw and did horrible things. War is necessary, but it's not pretty, and I am giving you a direct order to put that aside and focus on your family, focus on the life and happiness that you have earned, and you need to put that aside. And he kept getting letters from spouses saying, you saved my husband's life. So do you see what I'm getting at? That it's there waiting for us if we can just look into it.
Absolutely. You trigger a lot of emotions in me. Number one, just your stories. I'm teary-eyed listening to your stories. But with, I have so much own personal experience with, part of why I want to share. It's scary and it's very vulnerable to share with the public that I had my own psychic break. And I've reached that place, you see my success before and after. And, it's even hard for me to believe that I'd reached that point. But I've been there. I've been to that place of desperation, like just one step away from suicide, because when it's that dark and you are in that place of despair, you feel unpaired. You're exactly right. Like, I can tell you that from my own experience, that's true, that nobody understands and there's no way out. And it is that hopeless. Like, once you get to the place of total hopeless, I think I just never quite reached that place. Unfortunately, I got help and was able to start reversing myself before getting to the total place of hopelessness. But in my work to get better, I was dying physically, and my physical illness, I think, caused my body to break down, where my mental, psychological fortitude and toughness broke down too. So I couldn't live underneath this mask of almost breakdown. Probably I was just so mentally strong through surviving a lot of trauma and different things but once my body broke down, I couldn't hold that stuff any longer. So it came out in very PTSD type symptoms or experiences. But anyway, I like telling my own story to let people know that many people have been to this dark night of the soul, number one. So if you've been there, or you are there, or maybe you even get there in the future, that it's okay. Number one, like nothing's wrong with you, that it's part of being human sometimes to reach this state. But really, in reply to your point, is that going through my own work to heal my mind, if you will, is that's what my therapist did. When I went to get the help in LA and California, I had these amazing therapists, psychiatrists, psychologists, different types of therapists through EMDR work and somatic work and talk therapy and group therapy and meditation. I mean, I had many different types of therapies I went through to sort of heal myself or heal the break. But ultimately, what it got down to is through the work is exactly what happened to me, is exactly what you're saying. Is there were so many, the darkness that I was sitting with was so many, a lot of shame and guilt for things in my past and things that had happened kind of to me, but I felt responsible for, and some things I had created that I was responsible for, that I felt like I was a terrible human being that was coming up, that was part of the darkness. So when the therapist listened and pretty much gave the same commands as the general, it gave me permission, like, I'm okay? You mean I'm not that horrific person that I thought I was? And like, no, you're not. Krisstina, I've heard this very similar stories a million times. Like, you're no different than anybody else. It's okay. I give you permission to forgive yourself. And it was that type of thing that slowly but surely I became okay, because I got to let go of all those things I'd held on to. And it was that work of feeling listened to, and that I could let go of some of that stuff that was so deep inside of me.
So let me share what I've learned, because I've written 7 books, and one of them was Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder for Dummies in the Dummies series. And it's an unfortunate title, but it's 400 plus pages. And tell me if you can relate to what I'm about to tell you, because I've seen a lot of people who've been traumatized. And I want to change the diagnosis, because I think it's a useless diagnosis, PTSD, even though I have a book title. What I've learned from them is that when I've talked to them, and people, when they seem to get better, people say, oh, good, you're strong. You got over it. And when I've listened to these people, they'll say, I got past it. I never got over it. And I say, what do you mean? And then they'll get kind of quiet, and they'll say, I'm not the same as I was before. I'm doing much better. Coping's much better than being desperate, but I'm tentative. I don't put 2 feet into anything. I have fun. Things can be exciting, but I don't have joy and I don't have peace. But I'm a lot better than I was when I was totally messed up. And so my understanding of how trauma works is that when you're going through it, you do everything you can to survive. And you don't fully go through your feelings because it's so horrific. It's a state of horror mixed with terror, back and forth. And then what happens is, when you get through it, a couple of conclusions these people say is, I can't believe I got through it, and I could never go through it again. So all the symptoms to me of post-traumatic stress disorder is, and here's what I want to change the diagnosis. I'd like to throw away PTSD and replace it with what I call R.T.A. And R.T.A. stands for re-traumatization avoidance. Because what a lot of people say is, I can't go through it again. And a lot of the symptoms of PTSD, so if you think of a combat veteran coming back, and they're not relaxed anywhere, they're not relaxed with their families, they've seen awful things. So one of the places they're relaxed is in their car or their pickup truck. And they're driving along, they lower their guard, and then there's a horn. And so they have something called an increased startle reflex, where they jump out of their skin. And normally they have their guard up elsewhere, but a lot of the startle, and so one of the reasons they don't have peace is just when they're relaxing, they're vulnerable, but a loud sound suddenly startles them. And so there's no peace there. Also, they try to numb their life with compulsions, with drinking, spending, compulsive exercising, whatever it is, but they're trying to numb it to keep it under wraps. They often have nightmares because when you go to sleep, all that unfinished stuff pushes through as nightmares. And there's a belief that they can't re-experience it, or else they won't make it through the next time. And so the program that I would love to introduce, and if any of your listeners say I could help you with that, and I would start with veterans, but I think it would work with rape victims, and I've done it on a small scale, is what you do is you get people who have been similarly traumatized. So if it's a combat veteran, they've seen or committed killings. That's why Reach for Recovery for breast cancer survivors works, because those women all have that in common, breast cancer. And the idea is, in those groups, you have them start sharing stories of good times and bad times, because the basic underpinning of the approach is that events are unavoidable. They happen every day. Our having a conversation right now is an event for you. People even pulling away and hiding from the world is an event. So events are unavoidable. And what also is unavoidable is that events trigger thinking, feelings, and actions. And what happens is, when you're young or right after a trauma, those feelings, thoughts, and actions start to get hardwired into a conclusion about life. So one of the lesser known quotes from Albert Einstein, one of my favorites, is he said, the most important decision you'll ever make in life is whether the world is safe or dangerous. And so when you're young, if your conclusion is the world is unsafe, you look at it differently. And so the idea, and I've done this with some veterans, is that when you get them to share stories, and instead of saying, well, that's fine, what are you going to do today? Instead of being transactional, so what are you going to do today to make your life better? Well, the point is you're teasing them to start draining an abscess, and then you're suturing it before they drain it. And so I remember one veteran, I said, tell me about a good story in high school. Well, I scored the winning touchdown. And so I get him to relive it. So what happened? He tells me what happened. He said, then there was a parade. Well, how big was your town? Well, it was, medium-sized Midwest. So where were you? Oh, I was sitting, in the back of a car waving to people. What kind of car? Chevy. Remember the color? No, Chevy. Okay. Well, quit while we're ahead. What do you remember about your parents? They were cheering me on. So what'd you think? What'd you feel? What'd you do? And he said, I thought I could become a Big Ten quarterback. And how did that feel? It felt great. So what'd you do? Well, we lost the next game. But you can tell he relived the incident. And when he relived it fully, as opposed to my rushing him, he was able to reconfigure his relationship to the event and reconfigure the way he thought about it. Then I said, tell me about a bad incident during your teens. And he said, my sister committed suicide. So where did you hear? Who told you? Where did you even hear that it happened? Who discovered it? And he's right back there. And I said, what about your parents? Well, I kept warning my parents that she wasn't just being dramatic. I kept warning them, and they said, oh, she's just being adolescent. Well, then what happened? Well, they felt guilty, and they still do. Well, what's your relationship like now? Well, I still hold it against them, but I try to forgive them, but whatever. But right in that moment, see, as I kept him there in the incident, without forcing him to think differently about it, in the safety of the conversation, in the safety of that space, of that dialogue, he was able to reconfigure his relationship. And in a sense, he was able to actually feel, I'm getting a little emotional, feel the trauma to his parents and the guilt. And he felt it deeply. And in the conversation, he was able to let go of his grudge. So is this making any sense, what I'm saying to you?
Oh, absolutely.
And I think you can take this, but I think the key is have people, one of the short-sightedness of trauma treatment is people focus on the trauma and relieve the symptoms. But when you're really deeply traumatized, it went to your core. It broke something as far deep as you can go. And so the metaphor I use is the rings of a tree. If you think of a tree and every ring is a year, if you look at some trees, if a tree has some rotted rings, well, the tree still lived afterwards. So the idea is to go all the way back to the core of the tree. And something that I'm actually suggesting to couples, you want to bring intimacy back to your relationship. Say that you heard this crazy idea about sharing, events. And so you ask your partner, tell me about something you never told anyone that was a real positive thing. You never told me. Then tell me about a negative thing. So I've been married many years. I'm very fortunate, and she kind of grounds me, and we've been married 37 years. And I'm a little bit of an outlier. I mean, you can probably imagine that. It's not something I did on purpose, but fortunately, apparently I'm not an a-hole, so I don't belong anywhere, but I'm invited everywhere. But I don't belong anywhere. And I don't know, about a year or two ago, we're driving to San Diego with her sister, and it comes up that my wife was the 9th grade student body president. And I said, "You were what?" She said, "Oh, yeah, I was the 9th grade student body president." And then I remember that night when she was asleep, I looked at her and I started laughing. I can't believe I'm in bed with the 9th grade student body president. I couldn't be further away from that kind of person. I mean, even just saying it to you now, I start to chuckle, but it reconfigured kind of the way I looked at her. So I don't think this is rocket science. I think it's a way of helping people heal from the inside out. I mean, I would love to create a movement to sort of do that, because I think it's pretty straightforward.
Mm-hmm. I agree with you, and I'm totally willing. Would love to be part of that movement, creating that movement with you, because I do think something to this trauma thing, and it's so easy to bury, and that's really to sort of take us into this next direction of conversation. Is you and I were talking about this a little bit offline. And, the idea of happiness, but I think where we took the conversation, or where we wound up, we didn't take it anywhere. We sort of wound up here, but it's the happiness. It's almost hedonic happiness, but it's about happiness and achievement. So the way I buried my trauma, the way I buried sort of all those things I didn't want to address or didn't like, or I wanted to forget or whatever, is my compulsion was achievement. High achiever, always. I mean, always pushing myself, exercise, success, money, reward, everything was external. But it was so easy because it was really socially acceptable too. And I got a lot of accolades and applause for the achievement. But it was never a happiness, because whenever I got to that level, it still wasn't good enough, and I needed to get to the next level. Maybe I'd be good enough there, or I needed to, that external, like, okay, I made it to this level or that level.
You don't have to answer this.
Okay.
But briefly, say something about mom and dad. Warm, not warm, loving, uptight, critical, neurotic. Can you say anything?
Absent.
Okay. Okay, so you're going to need a handkerchief for this one.
Okay.
I write a lot. I write at the Huffington Post. I write Psychology Today, Harvard Business Review. And I wrote an article, and I'm not sure if I sent it to you, and it's why so many high achievers feel unfulfilled. And again, it's a way of listening to them from the inside out. And I come up with these terms: re-traumatization, avoidance. I try and come up with things that feel more correct. And a term that I came up with that fits you is what I call the Syndrome of Disavowed Yearning. And what it means is that when you were young, there was a desire for a warmth, not effusive coddling, but just a warm connection that wasn't to be had. And something didn't fully develop, and you needed to lean into the warmth that wasn't there because it was absent. And you discovered achievement. You said, "Oh, this isn't bad. Oh, and look, I got a tap on the head." But the point is, you reach a point where the achievement isn't bringing you joy or fulfillment. And the more you achieve, it's just sort of like another win. And what's happened is you disavowed needing the warmth because it hurt less. And I know this because I've done a lot of things, and I used to do house calls to dying patients and their families. And so I would try and bring people peace of mind at the end of their life. And there were a few people who were very wealthy that I would meet. And this was an interesting one. There was someone that I met. I can't say names, but people who have sort of parent issues will understand this. He was someone who was a very well-known musician, Grammys in multiple decades, but he was also known for drug use and run-ins with the police and all that. And he was sort of in the age of a comedian named Lenny Bruce. So it's way back when. And so I said to him, because I can be fairly direct, but people hopefully feel that I'm safe. And I said, you were known to be this, incredibly talented, but really miserable SOB. What was that about? And he said, I was enough of a child prodigy that I wasn't going to throw it away. But every time I achieved something, my pushy mother and my managers took credit for it. That's our boy. And I didn't throw it away completely, but it really contaminated my achievement. And one of the reasons that I did drugs and I had run-in with the law is I needed to do something that I own completely, and nobody wanted to take credit for my drugs and my run-ins with the law because you got to own something that belongs to you. And so that was my life, is that, I wasn't going to throw away my talent, but I never felt it totally belonged to me. The only thing I felt that totally belonged to me was when I was doing that. So I don't know if you can understand that kind of, twisted inside thing out, but that really goes back to the disavowed yearning. I mean, what he really wanted was someone to know him, who he was. And I'll share something else. We still have a few more minutes. Mm-hmm. I didn't have necessarily the happiest kind of childhood. And I kind of coped with it by being sarcastic and cynical and funny and witty and all that. And then I had my own sort of kind of breakdown and coming out of it during medical school. And what happened is I've had a series of 6 mentors, and they've all passed away. And I mentor about 25 people around the world, but still, I've always had a mentor. My last mentor was a fellow named Warren Bennis. And Warren Bennis, anybody in the field of leadership knows who he is because some will credit him with starting it. He mentored Howard Schultz at Starbucks, David Gergen, 4 presidents. And he died in 2014. And I decided not to get another mentor. I thought I would just absorb everything they gave me. And a year after his death, I had a bad day, and I'd never experienced what's called an anniversary reaction. But a year after his death, something didn't seem right. And I realized, he died a year ago. And then I've written a couple tributes to him. You can find them. And I wrote this thing about a year later, and something that I didn't get to tell him, but he'd be okay with it. I said, Warren, it wasn't your esteem or respect that helped me. It's that you enjoyed me. and you enjoyed me for me. I didn't have to do anything to earn it, and I couldn't lose it. And when I saw you, we would smile, and it had nothing to do with projects or what we were doing. And I put a smile that touched your heart. And when I could see that you enjoyed me in that way, I felt connected heart to heart. And what I wrote in that thing is, if you're a mentor, you have the power to heal people, not just help them succeed, but you can heal them. And there's more than a few of your mentees that could use that healing. And you might want to take advantage of that.
Wow. Yeah. Wow. And that you remind me of one more thing. Being when I went through my own treatment, some of the biggest healing came from group. And what was really incredible about group was, we're all there, and it was mostly, some sort of, mostly it was a lot of doctors, lawyers, mostly high achiever breakdowns. So funny enough, that's who I found myself with. But that we didn't know, clearly it's very confidential who's in the program. And so you don't really know who anybody else is, first name only, so on and so forth. But that was what we really learned, that we just connected soul to soul, and we were divulging some of our darkest secrets, and we still loved each other. Like, we fell in love with other human being without knowing what they did, who they were, how accomplished they were, how much money they made. None of that mattered. And you just gave me an opportunity that I felt liked, and the joy that came from just being me in my worst, darkest, most ugly state of being human, I was still loved, and vice versa. And we just were there and listened. And I think it was such a huge part of the healing that I realized that I'm lovable. No matter what, without all the success and labels and achievement, I am lovable just because I am. And I think those of us that really could get there and were lucky enough to be in some of these groups, we're the ones that really walked away healed, because at the end of the day, that's what we're all seeking. We just want to be loved for who we are, even if we don't know that that's kind of the core. And being to where we kind of started out is when we can share and be listened to, and we feel like people get us and vice versa. That's true intimacy and connection. And that's what we all need, but so much of it's just missing.
You're absolutely right. I have a personal mission called Healing the World One Conversation at a Time.
Oh, absolutely. And it is in conversation. And go back to the word you started with too, is learning to be present. Like, there's a lot of conversation now. I teach a lot about meditation and mindfulness, and there's this word presence, but you bring presence to a whole different level. It's really, thank you. I want to thank you, because you're causing me to think of the word presence differently than I've been thinking about it and talking about it. But presence is listening. It's being in the presence of
That's right.
another human being, and listening to them is fully present. And I'm really going to practice that. So thank you. Like, a different level of presence, and the presence is in the listening. And you can only do listening in having conversations and being human to human with other people, versus too much behind our devices and our achievements or whatever. Those are great too, but it's like we're just getting back to this our soul, our connectivity, our humanism.
Now, here's a quote that you'll like. You might not be able to take this to the bank, but you'll take it to heaven. You'll probably take it to the bank too. It's from a psychoanalyst named Wilfred Bion. And he said the purest form of communication is to listen without memory or desire. Because when you listen with memory, you have an old personal agenda that you're trying to plug the other person into. And when you listen with desire, you have a present or future personal agenda that you're trying to plug them into. And in my book, Just Listen, I'm humbled by it. There was no book tour. There was no advertising. It became the top book on listening in the world. And I've spoken in India, and what's interesting, I spoke in India and England on listening, but I can't get arrested in Russia or America because they want to be listened to. And I think that's so true. And so what I encourage people is be a PAL, and PAL stands for purposeful, agendaless listening. Purposeful, agendaless listening. And really the purpose, and again, I really do want to heal the world one conversation at a time. The purpose is to help the other person feel felt, not just understood, but feel felt in a safe way. Because when they feel felt, they will lean into it. And in the presence of your safety, whatever way they're twisted inside will untwist, and they'll reconfigure. I remember years ago, someone said to me, I need a plumber. And he said, what do you mean? And you'll relate to this. He said, my childhood was kind of challenging, and I'm like plumbing that was hastily jammed into each other, and it doesn't leak, but it doesn't flow. And what I'd like is someone to rip apart all the plumbing, reassure me that it's not going to fall apart or flood. Then I need to take a nap of about a year. And then when I wake up, I would love to just put the plumbing back together naturally from the inside out so I could flow.
That's beautiful. So a couple more things before we reach the end of our time together is you have your book on listening. So I'm going to read it just based on our conversation. It's like, oh my gosh, I have a goal to be even a better listener, a very good listener, and to really fully practice this art of being present. And you also have a book, you have, I think, 7 books, but another one that I find very interesting is you wrote a book called Talking to Crazy. And are there any tips that come out of a conversation in relation to that book when it comes to, we all in our lives either face some of these emotions, anxieties, desperations ourselves, or we have family members or friends. So do you have any tips, like just maneuvering better throughout life based on just built in that we're going to come across different levels of crisis?
Yeah, well, just listen is about how do you listen into people? How do you cause them to feel felt? And people open up. But the 2 favorite chapters in Just Listen one was steering clear of toxic people, and the other one was how to go from OF to OK, which is a way to calm yourself down. And so I said, well, maybe I'll just write a book on those 2 chapters. And Talking to Crazy is about the people that drive you crazy. I'm a compassionate doctor, so it's not about mental illness. There's a chapter about what to do if you're dealing with it. It's that relative that drives you crazy. And the difference is Talking to Crazy is not just listening into it, it's leaning into it. So they feel less alone. And we've done that on several occasions in our conversation today when I not just listened, but I leaned into you and you didn't push me away. In fact, I can see that you're saying, no, it's the contrary. I mean, I want more of whatever this is. And so when you listen into people and they feel less alone, then like with you, I think if you can make that connection and you feel less alone, then you don't have to keep disavowing yearning. And when you were talking about, and you almost got euphoric when you said, I was in this group and I was lovable just for me. I mean, I didn't have to do anything to earn anything. It was unbelievable. I was, I know what it's like to feel loved, but I've never felt lovable, and I felt lovable. I think that's cool. That's something all my achievement never gave me. And I have sort of a little quote that I learned from a rabbi friend of mine that I thought was really sort of fits this, and I think it's brilliant. What he said was, people who focus on being happy often turn out to be takers and end up unhappy, whereas people who focus on goodness are givers, and they're the ones who end up happy.
That's really good. So yeah, it really goes back to this place of being and presence versus achieving and trying to produce something.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, my gosh, I could talk to you for hours. You have shared so much. To complete us, I would love to ask you a couple more questions.
Sure.
And you're a psychiatrist, an MD. You've been, practicing for over 30 years. You've written lots of books, from trauma and serious crisis and despair and to suicide negotiation, all the way to happiness and existential happiness, really. So what do you think, like, based on this career, where are you at right now? Like, what do you know to be true that you've discovered through your career, through really one end of the spectrum to the other, that's really not obvious?
Well, I think what I've discovered, and I'm on a mission, and I'm going to recruit you. I'm creating the Warren Bennis Center for Leadership at a site called ExecuNet. ExecuNet has 750,000 vice president and above members, and it's for placement and tools and whatever. What I'm doing, and you'll love this, is I go to conferences, and I've noticed that there's often one speaker who's head and shoulders above everyone else, and they're often the most successful, but they come from goodness. And they come from kindness, and they're the real deal. And they're different from everyone else. And the person before them was ROI PowerPoint, and the person after them was ROI PowerPoint. But they're islands of goodness. So they come and they're kind of a breather in the conference, and they go back to their company, and they run them well, and they help their community. And so when Warren died, Warren Bennis, and when Nelson Mandela died, I viscerally felt that there's not just the vacuum in leadership, there's a corruption. It's poisonous. So what I do now is I reach out to those islands of goodness at those conferences, and I introduce them to each other. And I facilitate conversations, and I say, this is not about a project. What I want you to each talk about is, where did this goodness come from? How did you stay true to it? How have you dealt with the world who says you're being too naive? And what does it mean to you? And they're having the best conversations they've ever had, because it's the part of them that they're proudest of. But generally, they're attending to business, and I notice it because it just screams out at me. And so, I've actually told them, so I'm at the place where I'm just gathering them together, and I'm going to build a quilt. And I'm saying, and my tagline is, I'm going to take islands of goodness and turn them into a rising tide that lifts all hopes.
Oh, wow.
And so I'm just facilitating those conversations. And some of them, and I'm not saying, here's our project. And I say, kick me to the curb if I ever use the word summit. And all I'm doing is I'm connecting to you, and we together we will wait for the real purpose of coming together to reveal itself. But I don't want to hit you with a project, because you'll say, why did I say yes to another thing? I don't even have time. So I'm just saying, do you like these conversations? I'll introduce you to some other people. And they're loving them. I mean, it is crazy. These are busy people who maybe didn't reach that falling apart thing. And so they're having conversations where, like, the best part of you being with that group of other people. And so they're just, I'm getting emails saying that was the best conversation I've had this year. Someone said that was the best conversation I've ever had.
Wow.
So I'm building on that organically. I'm not going to turn it into a project, because if I turn it into a project, they're going to say, why did I say yes to this? And I'd say, no, I'm just going to be visiting you. And what I'll tell you and your audience, because I have too many people now, so I got to prune it down to about something manageable. So the next thing I'm going to tell them, and you'll be all over it, is I said, I'm going to say to them, what we are, and if you think this is too woo-woo, then you're probably not the best fit, is we are a community of love-spreading difference makers.
Mm-hmm.
Because what leaders are spreading are fear and anger. But this is a community of love-spreading difference makers, and I'm not backing off the word love.
I love it. One final question that I ask all of my guests is, I love the way you put it. You said, I don't know exactly how you said it, but along the lines of, I don't belong anywhere, but I'm invited everywhere. And so that tells me that you're a little unconventional by nature, maybe a little iconoclastic, not by intention, just by, I think, to use your own words, just this is the way you are. So, in an unconventional sense, in the world of psychiatry and traditional psychiatry, it's a very, lots of tradition there and traditional science. Are there any myths that are just blatantly not true that are pretty much conventionally believed to be true still today that you'd like to bust?
Yeah, I think we've lost our minds trying to pursue the brain.
Interesting.
And I think one of my frustrations with my psychiatric profession, I understand it, and I'm not against progress, but I think too many people, at least in my profession, hide behind brain science, and people need to feel felt. Do we have time for a quick anecdote or not?
Yes, please.
This is the one time I was invited at UCLA, where they were presenting on the inpatient unit. They were presenting a patient, and they present the patient, and then the resident talks about it, and then they bring the patient in, and I interview them. And so they're attending doctors, the top ones, and there's the residents, and then there's the medical students, the social workers, psychologists. So they bring in this young woman, and I have a way of conversing, because I also know what that's like to feel unpaired. And we start talking, and I invite her into this conversation, like, you look somewhere between scared and sad. Let's talk about that. And so she just starts opening up, and then our eyes lock, and finally, the attending says, "Mark, we have to discuss this. Or Dr. Goulston, we have to discuss this. We got to send her back to the ward." And she and I can't break our eye contact. And then she's walking out the room. She's looking into my eyes, and I say, "It'll be okay. You can get through this. I know you don't believe it, but you can." And she was just, I can just see it. This was 25 years ago, and she's looking at me. And they say, so Dr. Goulston, what's your evaluation diagnosis? And I said, she's really unhappy and sad. I mean, deeply unhappy. Find out what that's about. She feels alone in that. See if you can help her in those areas. Yeah, but what's her diagnosis? I said, well, it's what's ever in her chart. You're already charging the insurance. And what happened is the idealistic young people gave me thumbs up in the front row. It ticked off the other doctors, and I was never invited back. Mm-hmm. And so what I love about this fabric of goodness, the love spreading difference makers, and I think one of the nicest compliments someone has told me, they said, Mark, you're not the wealthiest person in the world, because I'm not about money, but you've stayed true to your values. You've stayed true to your values. In fact, what I say to companies, one bar is, here's how I'm going to kick out people. If you're not in for love spreading difference makers, you're out. And then the next bar is, I don't work with any company in which anyone is afraid to come to work because of someone else's personality. If they're afraid because they haven't learned something, haven't fixed it, that's one thing. And the reason I can't do that is because I've seen people's lives destroyed because one parent didn't take the kids away from the other parent. And I can't condone that. And so I will only work with leaders and saying, if that's happening, then your greed or whatever is really undermining who you need to be as a leader. And I don't want to help you. I'll help you with that. And so those will be the two bars. And so that should prune it down from about 35 to something manageable like 8. And then we'll go rock and roll.
Well, you're amazing. Talk about goodness. You are goodness. And you are a love-spreading difference maker. So thank you. Lead this movement. Be our, example of love-spreading difference maker. And it's been a real honor to have your time. Thank you for sharing it with us, for being present, for listening. And I hope this is just the beginning of a friendship, of a relationship. You're a man I'd really love to get to know, but thank you very much for your time.
Well, it's, I'm Jack Nicholson and you're Helen Hunt. You make me want to be a better man.
Well, I don't know how we can say anything after that. That's perfect. I will make sure in the show notes that we'll put links to all of your books and your incredible bio, and make it very easy for our listeners to connect with you, because I know they're going to want to. So thank you again, and we'll talk soon.
My pleasure, but you have to be at the front of the line.
Done. That's done deal.
Good.
All right.
To be continued.
There you go. I hope you enjoyed Dr. Mark as much as I did. If you want to learn more about Dr. Goulston, please be sure to check out my show notes at wealthywellthy.life. And before I close, I'd love to give a couple of shout outs to Feeling Good. Feeling Good says Krisstina has a penchant for learning, which is made evident by the extraordinary company that she keeps. So thank you, Feeling Good. And also, Spoons says, I've always been scared to think about money and was unsure of my feelings toward it. This has made it easier to have conversations around money and made me feel more comfortable using money as a tool to live the life I want. Yay. Thank you for sharing your feedback. I love hearing all of your feedback. So if you would, please leave a rating and review. I'd certainly appreciate it. And I'll be sure to give you a shout out in a future episode. Up next is Dr. Ann Shippey. She is an MD, a medical doctor, and trained in functional medicine. She's a functional medicine certified doctor. She's a good friend and a brilliant health practitioner. I love Ann. She's part of my team that's helped save my life. So you can imagine how much I adore her and appreciate her. But beyond me, she's truly committed to help people cure their own disease and reach optimal health using a functional medicine philosophy and approach. So you'll love Ann. Please enjoy.